Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in
Still
Ohio County.
With the allergies.
Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Here we go. A little snap of cold this week, but, we're not past the
frost-free day?
The frost-free day, thank you. The cold times.
Not quite, but we did just pass a momentous day, and that was Earth Day, the day that we celebrate all of the wonderful things that the earth gives to us, and also talk about how to take care of the resources around us.
Yeah, and it's just a good thing to be reminded of. Sometimes they could be a little cheesy, but if they weren't around, we wouldn't be thinking about them as much as we probably should. At least once a year, right?
At least once a year. Yeah, it'd be a little bit more helpful if we thought about it every day. And, for most farms, they do think about it every day. It's really important to manage the resources. And the most critical resource for any human being, animal, or plant is, of course, water.
It is the most important nutrient, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the only things that all life needs. Not so much oxygen, but water is a must.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some things out there that break that rule, but we're just going to go with that, okay? Well, let's talk about water. So, when we're talking about water from an agricultural perspective, there's really two kinds of water. So there's potable water, and then from any perspective, there's potable water and there's non-potable water. So potable basically means that you can drink it. It's clean water and it's safe to drink. Non-potable water means that it's not safe to drink. So the thing is that plants don't necessarily need the same level of potability as humans do. So when you're looking at plants, they can have some contaminants in the water, as long as we're not talking like heavy metals and things like that. But the most common thing we talk about is those biological contaminants, the coliform bacteria, and that's a pretty scary thing. But really, the number of coliform bacteria that are out there and the number that can harm us are vastly different. So really, when you're talking about coliform bacteria, the one everyone hears about is E. coli. But even in the E. coli family, there's only a couple that can make us sick. So those are the pathogenic E. coli. So E. coli 0157, that might give you a hint as to how many are out there. So when we're talking about potable water, we're talking about there's no presence of E. coli in your water. Now, when you're looking at irrigation water and you're going to be putting it on crops, it's not necessarily critical, especially in the early stages of your crop, to have zero E. coli or zero coliform bacteria in that water. And the reason for that is the sun is a great sterilizer and it can actually kill those bacteria. Especially if you're irrigating through drip irrigation and it's only going to the roots, then the risk associated with having water that may have those coliform bacteria is very minimal. And so whenever the Food Safety Management Act passed back in, I think it was 2015, water was a really big part. And it took them many, many years to really work out what the details were associated with the agricultural water and how we should be testing it and how we can help monitor it to keep our food system safe. So they separated water out into pre-harvest agricultural water and post-harvest agricultural water. So pre and post-harvest are two very different standards of water quality. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the pre-harvest, and Dan is going to cover the post-harvest.
I just kind of want to go back to what you were talking about with contaminants in the water, and we'll say contaminants in quote, right? Because plants don't have the same systems that we do, and obviously different things are going to affect us differently. It's normal to drip fertilize a plant, but you wouldn't drink that fertilizer, right? The plant benefits from it. It would be toxic to us to drink fertilizer.
Yeah.
And the thing you have to understand is plants require certain nutrients that to us might be toxic. They need to take up nitrates and they need to take up ammonia and they need to build those amino acids. But nitrates is something that is very toxic to us. So that's something that when you were talking about separating between pre-harvest and post-harvest, once it has the capability of being consumed, that's the risk that we're talking about. Not really risk for the plants, but risk for the human. So obviously you're going to handle it differently. You're going to use them in different ways. It's not illegal to drip fertilize plants, but you don't want to do that at the wrong time when that could potentially be consumed and then cause harm, such as with nitrates specifically. And there are different risk factors, right, associated with that consumption of that water. And usually we kind of break it down like this. Surface water is the highest risk. And Karen was saying that the sun can be a source of sanitation with the ultraviolet rays. And that's true. But when you start getting particles in the water and, the ultraviolet light isn't going to penetrate everything, and it's not going to be absorbed by everything, especially if in that runoff water you have a lot of dissolved solids in it, it'll start basically preventing that ultraviolet light from penetrating. And obviously it can only go so deep.
Right.
So when we talk about surface water, then we're pulling waste from the surface. We're talking about E. coli and stuff, but you also have to look at things like petroleum products, oil, asphalt, the stuff that once you get a rain and it washes and it goes into the streams, there's going to be all kinds of contaminants, and those aren't going to be fixed by ultraviolet light, but the biological stuff would, and that could be anything from human waste to animal waste, right? Animals are out there going to the bathroom, and when it rains, it washes everything to one place, to a pond, to a stream, to the lowest point of flow.
Right.
So that's typically going to be the highest risk. Groundwater does have a filtering mechanism through the soil to kind of clean it up. So groundwater is significantly safer than surface water. And the safest thing is treated water. So city water, county water is monitored and treated accordingly. So that's going to be the lowest risk because it is monitored, treated, and there's less unknowns in city water.
Right. And so just to give a little more depth on the different types of water sources, when you're talking about surface water, it's anything that is exposed to the surface, the air around you. So it could be water that you've collected off of your roof and into a rain barrel or a cistern. That counts as surface water because, birds sit on your roof, they poop on your roof, and that washes down into your collection system. And it could also be ponds, streams, anything that's open to the environment. And when you're talking about groundwater, then we're talking about wells and sometimes springs. So springs are kind of in that gray area between surface water and groundwater. And when you're looking at a spring and trying to decide which is it surface water or is it groundwater? The main thing is, does it ever get exposed to the environment? So if you have a developed spring where it collects directly, comes out of the ground and goes directly into a cistern and is never exposed to the air around it or the soil, then that counts as groundwater. Whereas if you have it collecting in, say, an old bathtub because you had it as a watering trough for your cattle, that counts as surface water. So if it's exposed to the environment, it's surface water. If it's not, it can be considered groundwater. And then, of course, we have our municipal water sources where it has been treated. Now, you can treat your own water. And if you have a water source that maybe isn't as clean as you would want it to be, or if it is exposed to the surface, you can treat that water and have your own internally treated water. But that, again, you want to be able to monitor that and test it to make sure your treatment is working as it should.
And there is a different standard for animal use versus human use.
Very much so, yeah.
So in the state of Ohio, private water systems that provide drinking water to rural or suburban areas, water wells, rainwater, cisterns, springs, hauled water tanks, and ponds used for drinking water, even though ponds are going to be higher risk like we've been talking about. So private water systems in Ohio are regulated under the Ohio Revised Code, and they need to be registered by the health department. And that's just, it's a safety precaution. The health department's going to have authority in small scale private water wells for safety reasons. There's a big risk involved with contaminated water, and there's certain standards that need to be kept up. And those include the total coliform. I don't know if we didn't go too much into that. So the biological contaminants like total coliform and E. coli, and then things like nitrates, stuff that can be very toxic to human consumption. It is regulation, but at the same time, it's, your own safety. It's safety of your family. It's one thing to be letting the cows drink water from an old bathtub, right? But the standards for human consumption are different. So there are certain standards in the Ohio Revised Code, and if in a small scale private water system, that regulation falls under the health department.
Right. And so we're kind of skipping ahead to the potable water, but that's cool because it's really the one water that everybody wants to deal with, right? Everyone wants to have drinkable water. But yeah, like Dan was saying, my dog is much less susceptible to E. coli and salmonella. And so whenever he drinks the random stream or puddle or whatever, it's not going to affect him like it would if I were to drink from it. And so that's one of the things where we really watch for, especially like, let's say you're going hiking in the backwoods. Once upon a time, whenever we drank the water regularly, we had a resistance to it and could maybe potentially fight off whatever bacteria was living in that water, but not today. We're used to drinking clean water. Our bodies do not have those resistances anymore. And so it's important to use a filtering system, even if you're out drinking from a really fresh looking, beautiful, clear stream. We don't know what type of pollutants could be in that water.
Yeah. Water is really tied to everything we do. But let's talk about some definitions here as far as like agricultural water. There's pre-harvest and post-harvest. So the pre-harvest stuff is like irrigating your crops, applying fertilizer or pesticide, so agrochemical applications, and then cleaning the equipment that is used on the crops. So that's all pre-harvest practices. So if you're spraying a fungicide using contaminated water, you can see where the risk is there. If you are drip irrigating so that it's just going into the roots with some higher risk water, I shouldn't say contaminated, but higher risk water, that's a different type of risk. If, depending on what you're consuming, if you're consuming a root crop like carrots, the drip irrigation might not reduce the risk as much as if you're drip irrigating in something like tomatoes. So there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of different acceptable risks that you can take. Post-harvest water practices include washing after you've harvested. So you're collecting the fruit or the vegetables, and you're cleaning them up to be sold, to be consumed. Cooling the fruit down or the vegetables down at harvest, and then also cleaning the equipment that you're using at that point. So there are different risks that are associated with both pre and post. And some of those examples, like I was saying, was utilizing drip irrigation versus like overhead irrigation, which we could talk about a little bit later.
Right. And so we do need to specify here that pre-harvest water does not apply to all crops. And so there's a certain list of crops that are covered under the Food Safety Management Act, and they are produce that is typically consumed raw. So when you're thinking lettuces and tomatoes and apples, those are all things that are typically consumed raw. Where if you're looking at, say, corn, corn you typically cook. And so it's not one of the things you have to worry about when you're thinking about your pre-harvest water. For post-harvest water, another thing that is included here, Dan mentioned cooling your produce, but also ice. If you're making ice to cool your produce, which is really common for, say, broccoli, then that water needs to be potable water as well. So anything that's used for post-harvest activities needs to be potable. That includes washing your hands too. So any water that you use for washing purposes for your hands or for your produce, that needs to be your potable water. So post-harvest activities, potable water. Pre-harvest activities, you have a little bit more wiggle room, but you do have to follow some certain testing requirements. And this is important because compliance dates are either here or nearing. So for all large or very large businesses, your compliance date is here. It was January 26th of this year. So you must be in compliance. For small businesses, you're looking at January of next year. For very small businesses, it'll be January of 2025. So it's really important that you pay attention to what these agricultural water standards are, because it is that time that you really need to start looking at compliance. Now, we really want to help educate our farms. So if you have questions regarding what you are required to do, please reach out to your local extension office or your local Department of Agriculture to get those questions answered as far as what you need to do for your farm. But when you're looking at the water quality standards, for water that is used post-harvest, you need to have standard potability statements of no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliters of agricultural water. The water must be safe and sanitary for its intended use. Now, this is the kicker here. Untreated groundwater must be tested 4 times a year initially, and then once per year if meeting the no detectable generic E. coli per 100 milliliters. So that goes back to your springs and your wells, okay? So you need to get 4 tests in the first year, and after that, once per year if it was observed to be a good potable source.
Yeah, and that water quality assessment, you can test for different things as well. So there's the physical and chemical assessment as well as the biological assessment. So things like total coliform, fecal coliform, generic E. coli, and the E. coli 0157H7 that's known to cause disease, those are all biological tests. Physical and chemical tests are things like water temperature. There's aspects of temperature that cause infiltration. We can get into that later, but they're going to measure the temperature of the water coming out that's being used for certain practices. And there's ideal temps for everything. And that helps mitigate any problems with infiltration of water where it shouldn't be. pH is an important one.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So when you're talking about infiltration, what he's really talking about is the fact that the surface of produce is permeable, okay? It breathes just like you and I, and our skin breathes. So the skin of your produce also breathes. And if you take a nice warm tomato and you drop it into a cold water bath, or even lettuce, you want to get it cooled off so that it has a better shelf life. Those are all great things to do, but when you're looking at 10 degrees difference between the temperature of your water and the temperature of your produce, it's going to suck in any water that's around it. And so if that water is potentially contaminated, you have a much higher likelihood of that going into the produce. So it just kind of sucks it right in. And the further apart the temperatures are, the more likely you're going to have that infiltration.
Yeah, and this is something that's difficult to do because chances are you're harvesting all day. You're not doing it at night because you can't see very well. I mean, you might for certain things, but for produce, you're going to be doing it in a day more than likely. The sun's going to be on it. It's going to be warm. And your water, more than likely, is going to be cold because it's in the ground, if you are using groundwater as an example. And then groundwater is typically cooler. So if you're washing the produce as you're harvesting, then it's not hard for that water to be colder than the produce. And what you actually want is to have that water 10 degrees warmer than the produce. So you're either cooling the produce before you wash it in the water so you don't get the infiltration, or you're warming up the water. But it's not something that would just happen naturally. It's something you have to be aware of because that temperature difference will cause the water to go inside the fruit, and any kind of contamination at that point could lead to food poisoning.
Right. And when you're looking at that infiltration, you're definitely going to have a higher frequency of infiltration for anywhere there is damage on it. So when you harvest a tomato, you are taking that stem off, and that stem leaves an opening for infiltration to happen. And there are some that have the very porous skin. Cantaloupe is one of the things that they've used to demonstrate this. And so you want to make sure that you're minimizing the time that your warm produce spends in cold dunk tank water. And you want to use sanitizers in your water. We have a whole list of produce wash water sanitizers that are appropriate for food use. And so, reach out to your local extension office or look around online to get that. But spraying it off is actually a better opportunity to keep your produce safe, because let's say you harvest your cantaloupe and one cantaloupe was contaminated out in the field, and you put it in that dunk tank. That stuff washes off of it and spreads all through that water. And then you put the rest of your crop in that dunk tank. Little by little, it starts spreading that contamination from one to another. So you do have to continually monitor the water quality of that dunk tank by using either chlorine test strips or, a test strip that represents the sanitizer that you're using. If you're using Sanidate or one of the other ones out there, it's really important to monitor that, and also to monitor the turbidity of your water, which is basically how cloudy it is. And so the more organic material that's in your water, the less that sanitizer is able to do its thing. So that sanitizer will grab on to all of those soil particles or plant particles that are floating in your water, and they're no longer going to be floating free, able to sanitize the water itself. So it's really important to keep your water clean, change it frequently, or just use a spray off system. You can also use forced air cooling, and that again is going to reduce the potential for contamination. So these are all steps that you can use when you're harvesting produce. And even if you're washing produce at home or cooking for a really big church gathering, let's say, and if you're washing your lettuce and you're just using the same sink water to wash each and every head of lettuce that you're going to use for this great big buffet, then again, that sink water is going to absorb a lot of the organic material that was on your produce and could potentially become contaminated. So you want to keep changing that water as well, or just run it through a colander and wash it that way. So there are steps that you can take to help maintain that cleanliness of the water that you started with.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. If you have a faucet, then the water is just going to go through. It's going to go straight down the sink or into the drain, and then you're going to move on to the next one, as opposed to having a big tub of water and you keep recycling that. So turbidity is a very important factor too, and it is one of the physical parameters that we look at. When we're thinking about cleaning water, we're talking about using some kind of chlorine bleach type solution to be able to kill the biological factors that we talked about that cause disease. So when you have a lot of turbidity in there, what happens is that chlorine gets bound up. And once it gets bound up, it can't kill the E. coli. And if it can't kill the E. coli, you're not really cleaning the water. So having that turbidity factor is really important. And we're talking about the physical assessment of water quality. Another thing is pH. Water is, by definition, neutral, which means that if it's pure water, you're going to have a pH of 7. pH can be an indicator of other problems. And even if it's not an issue with a health concern, by having a more acidic or a more alkaline pH, so things below 6.5 or above 8 at certain standards, will cause off taste, will cause a lot of the metals to be precipitated out into the water. And those metals, they can be toxic, but even outside of that, they're going to alter the flavor. They're going to cause issues with the quality of the produce. So you do want to measure not only the pH, but the turbidity as well. And of course, temperature. So there is a lot to look at when you are looking at water quality for either pre or post harvest uses. And as Karen was saying, it's a lot more critical to make sure that you have potable quality water at post-harvest than it is at pre-harvest, because there's ways of mitigating issues at pre-harvest that you just can't at post-harvest.
Right. And I do want to clarify in our last couple of minutes that when I was talking about compliance dates, it is for harvest and post-harvest water. They are still working on the pre-harvest water, and so those compliance dates are not in effect right now. It is just the post-harvest and harvest water. So anything you use from harvest onwards, that is what you must be under compliance for. Hey friends, we need your help. In order to help keep this show going, we need to hear back from you. Please take some time and check out our evaluation. You can either contact us directly for a copy, or you can go online to https://bit.ly/ here's the tricky part. Capitalize the next 3 words. Extension, calling, evaluation. Again, extension, calling, and evaluation all need to be capitalized. So bit.ly/extension, calling, evaluation. Give us your thoughts. Let us know if you like the show, and especially let us know if you've used any of the information you've gained from our show. Once again, you can reach us directly. You can call Karen at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Or you can reach Dan at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Let us know how you use the information that you get from this show, whether it is change in your shopping habits, a change in your gardening, or simply just expanding your mind. We want to know. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.